Chapter I. The Garden Fate Hook. It was one of those midsummer Saturdays that seemed determined to outdo itself in charm. The sky was a smooth stretch of robin's egg blue. The hedgerows hummed with bees, and every front garden in Chipping Darnley looked freshly swept by invisible hands. In the rectory's ample garden, the annual fete was in full swing, having drawn the entire village and a fair few from neighboring hamlets. There were tents pitched across the lawn like a gypsy, encampment striped in peppermint green and vanilla, white each housing a stall of some rustic amusement, tombolas and raffles, a second-hand book stall run by the vicar's wife, a cake competition judged with grave impartiality, and of course the fiercely contested preserves table. Miss Jane Marple sat just outside the shade of the large sycamore, close enough to the jam entries to observe without appearing to scrutinize. She wore a dove-gray hat with a silk flower and held an embroidery hoop on her lap. The image she presented was one of complete absorption in the cross-stitch of a peony, but her eyes flicked upward at regular intervals, quietly cataloguing each interaction, gesture, and overheard remark. "She's done it again," said Mrs. Dulcie Chudley in a tone of admiration mixed with weary resignation. She stood behind Miss Marple, fanning herself with a folded program. That widow Cartwright and her lavender jam. She could bottle moonlight and win a ribbon for it, if you ask me. "Consistency is a rare quality, Dulcie," murmured Miss Marple without looking up, "especially in preserves or people." The widow Cartwright was, indeed, the star of the hour. Slender and dignified in a lavender blouse that perfectly matched the soft hue of her winning entry, she stood beside the long trestle table, as if posing for a portrait. Her hands were gloved despite the heat, something she had done for years, and her expression was fixed in a genteel smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The judges Major Stockley, Mrs. Grinstead, and the butcher's wife had delivered their verdict an hour ago, and the blue ribbon now fluttered from a small stand beside the jar. The jam itself, pale amethyst and flecked with crushed lavender petals, sat under waxed paper and a tidy bit of gingham. It looked like something from a Parisian sweet shop, utterly out of place next to the more utilitarian raspberry or gooseberry offerings. Mr. Lionel Bellamy, who had arrived late and slightly flushed from a morning drive to the solicitor's office in Market Harborough, gave the jam a cursory glance and muttered something under his breath as he passed. He said, "Witchcraft," whispered Alice Hemsley, a clever girl with quick ears and quicker gossip. Said it wasn't natural for jam to smell like perfume. "Bellamy's just sore because he lost the land dispute," said George Pickersgill, chewing on a toffee. "Cartwright came out on top, didn't she? That orchard she inherited last year worth a fair sum, they say." "Hardly fair," muttered someone else. "Not when there was talk her husband didn't fall from that ladder by accident." Miss Marple's needle paused just for a moment. She resumed stitching, but now her eyes wandered to Lionel Bellamy. He stood near the rose arch, speaking to the vicar with forced joviality. His eyes, however, weren't on the conversation. They were trained on the widow Cartwright. There was a distinct tension beneath the civility of the fete. You could feel it in the staccato clinks of teacups and the polite laughter that rang too high. Beneath the striped tents and smiling faces, Chipping Darnley was a village coiled tight with unspoken things. The fete meandered on. Children raced around the lawn, clutching striped paper bags of barley sugar. The cricket pitch at the far end, held a desultory match between the curate's nephews and a group of scouts, half of whom were more interested in chasing butterflies. Near the tea tent, old Mrs. Pennington dozed off mid-scoon, only to be woken by her Pekingese yapping at a pigeon dot. Miss Marple took it all in with the same mild expression she always wore in public, a look that had been mistaken many times for absent-mindedness. In truth, she was cataloguing behavior, who had brought what dish, which conversations paused when certain people approached, and why Lionel Bellamy had left the fete and returned not 10 minutes later, visibly ruffled, with the faintest smear of soil on his trouser cuff. At precisely 3 o'clock, the brass band began playing Jerusalem. The opening notes rose warmly above the chatter, and a cheer followed the final crescendo. And then a scream. It wasn't the melodramatic sort one might associate with amateur theatricals. It was high, raw, and unmistakably real. Everyone turned. Alice Hemsley stood just outside the tea tent, her face chalk-white. One hand clutched her mouth. The other pointed. "There's someone behind the laurels." Constable Graves, who had been eyeing the sponge cakes with professional disinterest, straightened at once and strode through the crowd, parting the hedge where Alice had gestured. Major Stockley and 2 other men followed close behind. There was a pause, a heavy silence broken only by the nervous flap of bunting in the breeze. Then, "Doctor, someone fetch Dr. Sims." Within moments the party dissolved into anxious murmurs. The children were herded away from the bushes. Miss Marple, though urged to remain seated by Mrs. Grinstead, quietly made her way to the periphery of the scene. Unnoticed in the sudden flurry Mr. Lionel Bellamy lay face down on the ground. His head was turned at an unnatural angle, eyes wide, a faint grimace frozen in place. Nearby, a shattered jar glinted in the grass, the pale smear of lavender jam stark against the dark green Dr. Sims arrived, breathless and red-faced, and performed a brief examination. "Neck's broken," he said after a moment. "Dead instantly. Poor fellow. Must have slipped and fallen." Miss Marple crouched delicately at the edge of the laurel hedge, pretending to pick up a fallen button. Her eyes lingered on the broken jar. The pattern of the spill was odd, too neat, too central, almost placed. She observed, too, that Bellamy's hands were clean, no signs of stickiness. And yet the jam had been in the crook of his arm. "Miss Marple, do be careful," fussed Mrs. Chudley behind her. "That's no place for you." "Oh, I'm quite all right," Miss Marple replied gently. "It's just that, well, I always thought Mr. Bellamy disliked lavender." She said it lightly, with the air of someone musing aloud. But inwardly her mind turned over like the slow, methodical wheels of a grandfather clock. The broken jar, the sudden death, and the tension that had crackled through the fate like lightning waiting for a storm. The widow Cartwright had not approached the scene. She stood, back ramrod straight, a white handkerchief pressed to her lips, her eyes fixed on the crowd with unreadable calm. No one noticed that she was wearing gloves still. And somewhere deep in Miss Marple's sharp and sympathetic mind, a theory began to form. She straightened, brushed a leaf from her hem, and turned back toward the fete, where already the tea urns were being turned off and the bunting taken down. The garden fete had ended not with a raffle or a toast, but with a death, and Miss Marple suspected a murder. Chapter 2. The village reacts by the following morning. The Fates' bunting still hung limp and forgotten across the rectory hedges, sagging under the weight of dew and scandal. Chipping Darnley, normally slow to rouse on a Sunday, was alive, with whispers before breakfast. The death, for few now called it anything else, of Lionel Bellamy had shattered the illusion of village tranquility like a rock through a greenhouse pane. He dropped like a sack of flour, they say, muttered. Mrs. Cribbs at the baker's counter, her voice a mixture of relish and caution. Right there behind the laurels, dead as a doornail. Well, he was never quite natural, was he? Replied Mr. Elkins, the church organist, arranging his scones with unnecessary precision. Always poking about in people's affairs, asking questions that had no right to be asked. Thought himself clever. He was clever, snapped Miss Tuppin from behind her spectacles. And sharp-tongued, too. A solicitor's clerk with no tact and fewer friends. The shop door jangled again, and swept Mrs. Grinstead in her usual flustered dignity, still wearing the pearls she had worn to judge the preserves. "You've heard, I suppose?" She began without greeting. "Dr. Sims says the neck was broken clean through. Police have been called from Melchester. Inspector Cray, no less. He'll want to speak to all of us who were there, especially those near the bushes." Behind the murmurs and flapping hands, behind the carefully embroidered speculation, Miss Marple quietly selected a packet of Darjeeling from the grocer's shelf and made her way to the counter. She gave no indication that she had stood no more than 15 feet from Mr. Bellamy's body the previous afternoon, nor that she had already noticed a faint trail of crushed petals leading from the jam table to the laurels. "Morning, Miss Marple," said Mr. Pritchard, the grocer, lowering his voice with the reverence reserved for old ladies and gossip. "Terrible business yesterday. Did you see it?" She smiled gently. "Just the aftermath, Mr. Pritchard. I do hope the children weren't too upset." "Oh, the little ones were spirited away quickly enough," he said, lowering his voice. "But the older ones, especially that Hemsley girl Shaken, she was. Thought she'd found a wasp's nest," she said. "How unfortunate," murmured Miss Marple. "Wasps can be terribly deceptive creatures. They look so purposeful." As she stepped outside with her tea and half a loaf of bread, she noticed a figure standing by the church lich-gate. Reverend Mayhew, deep in conversation with the widow Cartwright. Miss Marple paused briefly by the post-box, careful not to be obvious. The widow's posture was perfectly still, her hands clasped, the gloves now a soft dove-gray. Her face bore the expression of a woman who had expected to be accosted, and had resolved to meet it with dignified silence. "Truly, I am most dreadfully sorry, Mrs. Cartwright," the vicar was saying. "It was right near your table, after—" "Oh, I shall try not to see it as an omen," she replied coolly. "These things happen, Reverend. Sudden deaths, accidents. God has a way of reminding us who is in charge." "But you knew Mr. Bellamy, didn't you?" The widow gave a small smile. "Everyone knew Mr. Bellamy. He made it his business." She turned then and walked away without so much as a backward glance, her skirt brushing softly against the low stone wall dot. Miss Marple watched her go. Few people walked that upright without some training or something to conceal. Back at her cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat with a cup of tea cooling beside her. She had begun to lay out her thoughts, not in any formal way, but as she had learned to do over many years of village life, by pattern recognition. People, she often said, were like patchwork. You might not see the full design at once, but if you recognized the stitches, you could predict the shape. There had been an oddness to the way Lionel Bellamy had moved about the fate. Not just the tension in his jaw or his sharp mutterings, but the way he had disappeared for those 10 minutes. She remembered him striding past the jammed tent with a face like thunder, and when he returned, what had changed? She tapped her fingers against the armrest. A bottle of jam had been shattered near the body. Lavender jam, but he hadn't been holding one before. He hadn't bought one. No one had seen him return with anything. Had he picked it up from the table, or had it been placed near him after? Death? And what of his last words? Had there been any? Dr. Sims had said the death was instant, but Alice Hemsley had seen something or thought she had. Miss Marple made a mental note to speak to the girl. Young people rarely understood what they'd witnessed, but they were often more observant than they realized. A knock at the door startled her from thought. It was Inspector Cray. "Miss Marple," he said, polite but brisk. He was a man of few words, with shoulders like a bricklayer and a mustache that looked permanently disapproving. "I'm making inquiries. I understand you were present at the fete." "Why, yes, Inspector. I believe half the county was." She motioned to a chair. "Would you care for tea?" "No, thank you, ma'am. I'll be brief." He opened a small notebook. "You didn't see the deceased fall?" "No, I heard the scream like everyone else and went to see." "Though I did observe Mr. Bellamy earlier in the afternoon, and again shortly before the unfortunate incident. Did he seem distressed?" "Agitated, certainly. He appeared to be arguing with someone earlier, and afterward he was alone, walking toward the churchyard." "With whom was he arguing?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "That I couldn't say with certainty, but the widow Cartwright was near him at the time." Inspector Cray's pencil paused. "You think she might be involved?" "Oh, I never think anything without reason, Inspector. I only observe. Though I did find it peculiar that she was still wearing gloves long after the judging had ended and the heat had quite settled." Cray blinked. "You think that means something?" "Perhaps," she said lightly. "Or perhaps she is simply fond of gloves." The inspector closed his notebook. "Thank you, Miss Marple. If anything comes to mind, I trust you'll get in touch." "Of course," she replied with an innocent smile. "Though sometimes, Inspector, things don't come to mind at all. They merely stay there, waiting to be noticed." After he had gone, she remained seated, fingers resting lightly on the teacup. The village would be swarming with questions by evening, and as always, behind every question lay a little truth and a great deal of avoidance. It would be easy, Miss Marple thought, for the police to fixate on an obvious suspect, someone with a motive or a reputation or a quarrel known to others. But people rarely killed out of one reason alone. It was always a tangle of things, grievances, secrets, pride. She turned her gaze to the window. In the soft afternoon light, a bee moved among her roses, oblivious to human drama. A murder had occurred, and beneath the surface calm of Chipping Darnley, something else had begun to stir. Chapter 3. Early investigation. By Monday morning, Inspector Cray had established his temporary base in the back room of the King's Wren, Chipping Darnley's only inn, its oak-beamed ceilings and stiff chairs giving an air of accidental solemnity to the investigation. The villagers, unused to formal police presence, responded with an odd mixture of thrill and terror. Mrs. Tuppen called it like having a royal visit if the royal were armed and suspicious. The list of those interviewed was growing longer by the hour. Most offered little more than repetition. A scream, a rush to the laurels, a dead man. Everyone seemed to believe it had been an accident, or rather, they said they did, though few sounded convincing. Miss Marple, of course, said nothing directly, but she listened, and she walked after attending morning prayers at St. Jude's, a modest affair with more empty pews than filled ones. She took a slow rut toward the rectory grounds. The fete was gone. Only the flattened grass and a few discarded paper cups remained, along with a faint scent of crushed lavender that lingered unpleasantly in the sun. She paused at the laurel bushes, now marked with a discreet police ribbon. Her eyes, trained by years of domestic detail and village curiosity, saw more than a passing glance might. There, just beyond the laurels, was a second scuff in the grass, not where Mr. Bellamy had fallen, but behind the hedge, closer to the yew trees. A second person might have stood there unseen, watching, or perhaps waiting. Just then, a voice interrupted her thoughts. Miss Marple? She turned. Alice Hemsley, the blacksmith's daughter, stood a few feet away, twisting a kerchief in her hands. Her dark eyes were wide and strained eyes that had seen something they couldn't quite explain. "Oh, Alice," Miss Marple said gently, "you must be very tired of people asking you what you saw." The girl nodded. "They keep saying I imagined it, or I screamed too soon. But I didn't. I saw him. He sort of fell wrong. Alice hesitated, struggling to articulate something she didn't yet understand. "I mean, people who fall, they flail or they cry out, don't they? But he just dropped, like he'd been pushed or struck, or something inside him just turned off." Miss Marple took the girl's hand. "It's very hard to watch something like that. Your mind tries to protect you. Sometimes it hides what it saw." Alice blinked, then said there was a sound, like glass cracking, right before he hit the ground. "Not as he fell?" "No. Before, I thought someone had stepped on a bottle or jar or something. That's why I looked. That's what made me scream." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice remained mild. "And you didn't see anyone else near the laurels?" Alice shook her head. "Just Mr. Bellamy. But he was holding something. Or he was going to. I saw his hand go out and then down. That's when the scream just came out of me. I couldn't help it." Miss Marple thanked her with quiet kindness and watched the girl walk away, shoulders hunched. The child had seen more than she could say, and perhaps more than she knew. Later that day, in the drawing room of the vicarage, a very different sort of conversation was taking place. Inspector Cray stood with arms folded, listening to the widow Cartwright. "I assure you, Inspector," she said, with a tone honed over decades of widowhood, "I had no reason to wish Mr. Bellamy harm. Our disagreements were entirely civil. He was unpleasant, yes, but never threatening." "But you were seen speaking to him," Cray replied. "You argued, apparently, not 2 hours before his death." "We debated," she corrected him, "over boundaries, legal ones. The orchard that my husband left me is adjacent to land the Bellamys once leased. Lionel seemed to think I'd encroached." "Had you?" "Of course not," she said flatly. "The deed is clear. But Lionel enjoyed conflict. He was always stirring some pot or another. The inspector made a note. Did he threaten legal action? No, she replied. Though he threatened scandal. He said he'd found something papers, letters, something from years ago that would redefine my position in the village, whatever that meant. I assumed it was just his usual bluster. Cray looked up. Did he say what those papers were? No, and frankly, Inspector, I didn't ask. I don't scare easily. Miss Marple, who had been seated quietly in the corner, pretending to knit, a skill she had abandoned long ago, but used to admirable effect in gatherings, raised her head. You've lived here how many years now, Mrs. Cartwright? 22, since my husband's accident. Of course, Miss Marple said with a kind smile. That dreadful ladder. I remember hearing it cracked right through. Rotten wood, wasn't it? A flicker passed through the widow's expression. Not fear, more like irritation, quickly suppressed. So they said, she replied. The coroner was satisfied. Indeed. Miss Marple lowered her gaze. Still, one can't help but notice how tragedy seems to follow the same paths as rumors, always turning up where they're least wanted. The room fell into a stiff silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Outside, the news of Bellamy's death had taken new shape, no longer a tragedy, but a mystery. Theories flourished like weeds. Some said it was the jam poisoned, perhaps. Others swore it was a fall, a simple, clumsy fall. Miss Tuppin insisted it had to do with foreign politics. He was always writing letters to the editor about tariffs and Russia. Perhaps it was espionage. But others spoke more quietly about the widow Cartwright, about the orchard, about the fact that Lionel Bellamy had recently made a visit to the county archives in Melchester, looking into old deeds, old family arrangements, digging, as he was known to do. And what he'd found, apparently, had frightened someone. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the lane as dusk settled over the hedgerows, and the last of the swallows skimmed low over the grass. She sipped her tea and recalled the precise shade of the jam spilled in the grass. A pale violet, almost theatrical dot, she reached for her notebook, not for clues, but for people. She wrote 5 names. The widow Cartwright. Inheritance, old scandals, a threat from the dead man. Still wore gloves. Alice Hemsley, innocent but observant. Might recall more if prompted. Gently. Lionel Bellamy. The kind of man who never leaves things well enough alone. George. Pickersgill. Seen arguing with Bellamy weeks ago over unpaid land rent. Miss Donkey Chudley. Knows everything about everyone, and lets slip more than she realizes. Below those she wrote, the jam. Why Lavender? Why there? A mystery had settled over Chipping Darnley like morning mist, and Miss Marple, who knew mist and mysteries well, understood that the clearest answers often began in silence. Chapter 4. First suspects. By Tuesday morning, Chipping Darnley had begun to settle into that peculiar rhythm familiar to any village, caught in the soft throes of scandal. Routines maintained outwardly, while conversations hummed like electric wires beneath the surface. The market carried on. The post was delivered. Children walked to school. But in every shop, along every hedge-lined path, Mr. Lionel Bellamy's death lingered in the air like wood smoke. The official verdict from Melchester was still pending, but Inspector Cray had already marked 2 names in the corner of his notebook, George Pickersgill and Mrs. Cartwright. They had both motive and proximity. he said flatly, standing by the police car with his constable, and both had prior disputes with the deceased. Constable Fennel, a young man with more ambition than tact, nodded eagerly. "Shall I bring Pickersgill in for formal questioning?" "Not yet. Pressure reveals things more than confinement. Let's allow them to squirm a little." Asterisk, asterisk. That same morning, Miss Marple took her customary walk to the churchyard. It was not just for her health, though she always claimed it was. Churchyards, she believed, offered more than peace. They preserved secrets beneath their stones and in the sighs of those who passed through them. There she encountered Reverend Mayhew, who greeted her with the air of a man permanently unsettled by recent events. "Miss Marple," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "I don't know what to make of it all. I've known Lionel since he was a boy sharp as flint, but, well, never liked. And George Pickersgill, he's a brute when he drinks, but a murderer?" "Murder wears many coats, Reverend," she replied gently. "Some tailored in rage, others stitched together by opportunity." "I suppose," he sighed, "but we're a quiet village. We've had our spats, our silly feuds, never doth this." Miss Marple's gaze fell to a nearby gravestone. It bore the name Thomas Cartwright, D. 1913. "Do you recall the inquest into Thomas Cartwright's fall?" The vicar looked surprised. "Good heavens, that was long before I came to the parish." "Of course," she said softly. "But I wonder who kept the records." Asterisk, asterisk. Meanwhile, George Pickersgill was not a man taking the scrutiny lightly. "I told that blasted inspector I didn't see Lionel at all that afternoon. He barked at the barmaid at the King's Wren. I was tending the cider barrel, then the bloody raffle." "But you were arguing with him just last week," she pointed out, nervously wiping down the countertop. "He owed me £4, George snapped, "for clearing that bramble patch near the orchard. Said it wasn't in his lease. I told him he was a nitpicking devil and not to come near my land again." "That's not a crime." "No, but it's not nothing either," came a cool voice from the doorway. It was Mrs. Chudley, who'd just come in for a sherry, but had clearly come prepared to stir something else entirely. "I saw you near the laurels, George, just before the scream. You were wiping your hands on your trousers." George flushed darkly. "I'd spilt cider on myself." "If you're implying, I imply nothing," Dulcie said with a smile. "I merely observe. You might want to try it sometime." Asterisk, asterisk. Back on Church Lane, Miss Marple received a quiet visit from Alice Hemsley, who had walked over after school. "I remembered something," Alice said, "about the jar." Miss Marple ushered her in with warm encouragement. It had a gold ribbon. Alice continued, "Not the usual string or cloth. That's why it stood out when I saw it right before Mr. Bellamy fell." "A gold ribbon," Miss Marple repeated, pouring tea. "How unusual. Most of the entries used gingham or brown string." Alice nodded quickly. "And the label, it was different. Curved letters. Like it wasn't from the table at all." Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward. The fete had strict entry guidelines. Each jar was required to be plainly labeled, no excessive decoration. If the jam that broke near Bellamy wasn't from the competition table, then where had it come from? And why had it been there? She thanked Alice, sent her on her way with a biscuit, and returned to her notebook. A gold ribbon, an odd, almost theatrical touch, something intended to draw attention. That evening, the second suspect came under greater scrutiny, the widow Cartwright. She had received a formal visit from Inspector Cray, who came armed with a tone of forced politeness and a bundle of carefully phrased questions. "Mrs. Cartwright, is it true Mr. Bellamy accused you of forging part of your property deed?" She did not blink. "Yes, Inspector. In a letter last month. I gave it to my solicitor. Mr. Bellamy was misinformed." "And where were you between 2:50 and 3:10 on Saturday?" "In the tent, speaking with Mrs. Grinstead and Miss Tuppin. We were discussing the sponge cakes." Cray nodded. "And the gloves, ma'am? You've been wearing them in this heat? Any reason?" Her expression was mild. "Arthritis, I see. Would you mind if we inspected them?" "Not at all." She removed the gloves. Her hands were smooth, not inflamed, but there was a bandage across the base of her right palm. "Caught it on a rose thorn," she said with a thin smile. "Pruning the morning of the fete." Inspector Cray made another note. His expression remained unreadable. "Thank you, Mrs. Cartwright." She did not ask if she was under suspicion. That, perhaps, was a most telling detail of all. As the sun set over the village that night, the rumors grew thicker than the mist on the fields. 2 suspects. 2 motives. George Pickersgill with his temper and his debt. Mrs. Cartwright with her inheritance, her secrets, and her gloves. But Miss Marple knew better than to settle too soon. She had learned that first suspects were rarely final ones. Murder, like mildew, tended to creep in corners less obvious. She thought again of the jar. Not the jam itself, but its placement, its purpose. It was a signal. Or perhaps a message. She sat down once more at her writing table and carefully penned a note to a friend in Melchester with access to parish archives. Just a simple question. Was there ever an incident involving Thomas Cartwright before his fall? Any complaints? Lodged? Witness statements? Miss Marple believed in patterns, and this one, she suspected, had begun far earlier than the fate. The game was unfolding now, quietly, carefully. Chapter V. A hidden clue Wednesday dawned pale and damp, with a mist clinging to the hedgerows and curling along the cobbled lanes like an old cat unwilling to leave its perch. Chipping Darnley's early risers were fewer today, though not from laziness. There was something else now in the village air, an alertness, the sense that someone, somewhere, knew more than they were saying. Miss Marple, dressed in a soft mauve cardigan and wearing her sensible walking shoes, made her way to the rectory garden just after breakfast. Officially, she told herself she had dropped by to collect a pair of knitting needles she had left behind during the fete. Unofficially, well, Miss Marple rarely did anything entirely officially. She was not alone. The rectory's gardener, young Peter Larch, was kneeling near the laurels, tugging out weeds with methodical dismay. "Good morning, Peter," she said pleasantly. "Miss Marple," he replied with a courteous nod, then paused as if weighing something. "Strange thing this all is, Mr. Bellamy and all. They say it might not have been a fall." "Oh," she replied mildly, as though hearing it for the first time. "Well, that jar, the one smashed next to him, that's what's got people puzzled. Police asked me if I'd seen it before." "And had you?" Peter stood and brushed the earth from his knees. "I reckon I did, but not on the preserved table. No, ma'am. I saw it earlier, about half an hour before everything happened. It was sitting under the fold-up table by the hedge. Miss Marple tilted her head. Under the table? Yes'm. Didn't think much of it then. Looked like someone had tucked it away, maybe forgot it. But I remember the ribbon, bright gold. Miss Marple's brow creased very slightly. Tell me, Peter, did you see anyone near that table around that time? He scratched his chin. I was over by the trellis then. Saw Alice Hemsley go past, and then that fellow from the council, Mr. Tremaine. But the only one who went near the jam table itself was Dulcie Chudley. Dulcie? Yes'm, she was fussing with the displays. Said one jar had been placed crooked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She is particular about symmetry. Peter nodded. Too right. But she didn't touch the one under the table, far as I saw. Still funny place for a jar, don't you think? Yes, Peter, quite. Miss Marple thanked him, retrieved her knitting needles, and walked slowly back down the garden path. The details settled in her mind like a dropped pin. Someone had deliberately placed a jar of lavender jam under the table, hidden from view, but not entirely out of reach. And when it appeared beside Bellamy's body, no one questioned where it had come from. It was as if its presence was meant to confirm something or distract from something else. Asterisk, asterisk. That afternoon, Inspector Cray summoned Dulcie Chudley to the King's Wren for a clarification of timeline. She arrived in her best navy skirt, a cascade of brooches on her lapel, and the unmistakable air of someone who considered herself immune to interrogation. You were seen near the preserve table before the incident, Cray said without pleasantry. I was judging, Inspector, she replied crisply, and correcting the appalling lack of visual harmony. One jar was half an inch out of alignment. I should think that's not a crime. You didn't notice a jar beneath the table? I did not. But then I wasn't groveling around on my hands and knees. Her smile was tight. Ask Mrs. Grinstead. She was beside me the whole time. Did you handle any of the other entries? I adjusted one or two, Dulcie admitted. But I did not tamper. I take competitions very seriously, Inspector. It is entirely possible that someone else added a jar afterward, hoping to confuse matters. Miss Marple, seated innocuously at a nearby table, with a plate of seed cake and her embroidery, sipped. Her T-dot she knew Dulcie well enough to detect when the woman was too emphatic. There was a defensiveness in her tone that suggested not guilt, but fear. Dulcie was not a murderer, Miss Marple suspected, but she had seen something or done something that now frightened her. Asterisk, asterisk, later that evening, the envelope arrived. Cream paper, Melchester postmark. A brief note, penned in a tight legal hand. From her friend Mr. Holden at the registry office. Miss Marple read the words twice, then folded them with care. Re. Thomas Cartwright, deceased 1913. Complaint filed April 1913 by Estate Manager Lionel Bellamy Sr. Allegation. Misuse of orchard land under shared lease. Hearing cancelled. Incident reported 1 week later. Cartwright fell from ladder. Case marked closed. So. The Bellamy Cartwright feud did not begin with property in 2025. It was old, perhaps inherited, and Lionel Bellamy had been digging into it. Stirring embers. Miss Marple rose and walked slowly to the bookshelf, where a small pressed flower album sat beside the family Bible. She opened it to the last page and added a note on a slip of paper. History often repeats itself, especially when one generation leaves unfinished business for the next. Asterisk. Asterisk, the next morning brought another shift in the mystery dot at the village green. Constable Fennel posted a notice on the board. The coroner's preliminary report. The cause of death was officially listed as cervical fracture consistent with force applied to the neck. Origin unclear. Not a fall, not definitively an accident. Not yet murder, but leaning toward it. The village took this as license for wilder theories. I still say it was the jam, muttered Mr. Elkins at the grocer's. Some kind of nerve poison. 2. Quick for poison, Mrs. Grinstead sniffed. He dropped like a sack of coal, more like something snapped. You ask me, said Alice's father grimly. He got what was coming. Stirring up secrets from the war years. There's things better left buried. And from the back of the shop, quietly but firmly, it wasn't George. It was the voice of Mrs. Pickersgill, George's long-suffering wife. Her eyes, red from lack of sleep, met Miss Marple's. My husband's many things, she said, but he wouldn't kill a man in front of half the village. He's not clever enough. Ah, thought Miss Marple. A telling phrase. Not clever enough. Murder required boldness. Yes, but also cunning, timing, and most of all, intention disguised as accident. And someone very particular had intended for that jar to be noticed, not to kill, but to frame. The clue was not just the jam, it was the gesture, the theatricality of it. Like a scene set just for the audience. And that, Miss Marple mused, pointed to someone who understood performance, who relished attention, even in tragedy, someone not yet suspected. Soon. Very soon. Chapter V. Confrontations and Secrets by Thursday. Chipping Darnley had passed from shock into something far more volatile speculation. People no longer wondered if Lionel Bellamy had been murdered. They simply debated how and by whom. Each person in the village had an opinion, each opinion grounded in just enough truth to sound plausible, and just enough fiction to be dangerous. And though the police had yet to name a formal suspect, the villagers had made their own conclusions. George Pickersgill now sat in the stocks of public gossip, his temper and past debts being dressed up as motive. The widow Cartwright, meanwhile, occupied that precarious space between fascination and fear, a woman too composed, too graceful, to be dismissed entirely. But Miss Marple, from her garden perch, was not so easily swayed. She had seen enough of human nature to know that motives rarely stood alone. What mattered more were moments, glances, slips, silences, and now those were beginning to show. Asterisk. It began with Dulcie Chudley. The local sewing circle met that afternoon in the parish hall. Miss Marple attended not for embroidery, though she brought her usual work-basket, but because, in her experience, nothing prompted truth like a circle of women with sharp needles and busier tongues. Dulcie arrived late, her lips thinner than usual, her stitching jerky. She avoided eye contact with Miss Marple. After some time, Miss Marple leaned slightly toward her, and said in a voice too low for the others, "Was it you who moved the jar, Dulcie?" Dulcie's needle paused mid-stitch. "I beg your pardon?" "The jar, the one beneath the preserve table. You saw it, didn't you? But you said nothing to the inspector." "I don't know what you're implying." "Only that you've judged the competition for 11 years, and you would certainly have noticed an unlabeled, ineligible jar left beneath the table, especially one with a gold ribbon. Donkey looked around, then whispered, "I did see it. I assumed it had been placed there for safekeeping, and then, after the accident, I realized it had been used." "Used how?" asked Miss Marple. "As part of the ... scene," Donkey said. "It was staged, wasn't it? The whole thing. That jar was never meant for judging. It was meant to be found." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, I believe you're right." Dulcie's hands trembled slightly. "I was afraid to say anything. You understand? If I'd moved it, if my fingerprints were on it ... You were right to be cautious," Miss Marple replied, "and wiser still to speak now." Elsewhere, Inspector Cray conducted his own inquiries, but with diminishing patience. The widow Cartwright, when summoned again for questioning, met him in her parlor, composed and unreadable. "Why didn't you tell me Bellamy had made inquiries about your first husband's death?" Cray asked. She arched an eyebrow. "Because he hadn't. Not until the week before the fete. By then it was too late to matter. Thomas has been dead for over 20 years, and yet Bellamy was combing the parish records. Perhaps he suspected foul play." She gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "If he did, it was only because he hoped to discredit me. He couldn't bear to see a woman hold land he thought was his. By legacy, he was like his father, obsessed with restitution." Cray leaned forward. "And what about the injury to your hand?" "I told you. A thorn." The inspector produced a small evidence bag. Inside, a bit of broken glass with a smear of lavender-colored residue. "We found this fragment in the laurels, alongside others from the jar. This one has blood, likely from a shallow cut." Her smile didn't waver. "Then perhaps your murderer was clumsy." Cray studied her for a long moment. "You're very calm, Mrs. Cartwright." She folded her hands. "My life has taught me to be." That same evening, a quiet visitor arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It was Mrs. Pickersgill. She stood at the gate awkwardly, her face drawn, eyes dark with fatigue. Miss Marple, sensing the woman's turmoil before a word was spoken, beckoned her in with a gentle nod. "I won't stay long," Mrs. Pickersgill said, "but I needed to tell someone. I saw George take something from Mr. Bellamy's coat pocket after he was dead." Miss Marple set down her cup. "Go on." "He said it was a receipt. Something from the land registry. I didn't ask. He burned it in the stove that same night. But he's been drinking more since, sitting up late, pacing. He says he didn't kill him." "But he's afraid, Miss Marple." "I see," said Miss Marple. The older woman grasped her hands. "I don't believe he did it, not truly. But I think he knows who did." Miss Marple sat in silence long after her visitor left, the evening shadows growing long across her lace curtains. What kind of man rifled the pocket of the dead? Not a murderer, a scavenger, a desperate man, perhaps. One who feared what the dead might leave behind. And what of the paper? A receipt from the land registry? Burned, destroyed before the police could see it? Miss Marple thought again of Lionel Bellamy's habits. He was not a careless man. If he'd carried something important, some discovery, he would not have kept just one copy, which meant somewhere, hidden or forgotten, was the original ... The following morning, she found it. not in a file cabinet or a solicitor's office, but tucked away stuffed into the back of the parish library's local history volume. Miss Marple had spent the morning sifting quietly through the village archive under the guise of preparing for the flower show. The clue came in the form of an unsigned note on Bellamy's legal stationery, folded between pages describing the Cartwright and Bellamy families' land exchanges in the 1900s. She read the note slowly. Then twice, deed fragment shows orchard boundary amended posthumously, 1913, without formal witness. Filed by JTC under guardianship clause, suggest forgery or familial pressure. Link to widow, further inquiry required. Documents to follow once full transcript delivered. Dated July 18th. Miss Marple folded it gently and placed it into her handbag. The date was 2 days before the fete. Bellamy had found something dangerous, something that threatened to strip the widow Cartwright of her inheritance and possibly her reputation. But something else in the note disturbed her more. The language. It was dry, precise, but anxious. Bellamy had intended to follow up, but he hadn't, because someone had stopped him. Asterisk, asterisk, the village carried on as the week wore down, but now the air was taut, brittle. Secrets had risen to the surface like silt in a stirred pond. Mrs. Pickersgill's revelation, Dulcie's evasion, the widow's unshakable calm, and now a buried note. Miss Marple stood once more at the edge of the rectory garden, looking at the place where Lionel Bellamy had fallen. A summer fate interrupted, a broken jar, a crooked past. She did not yet have all the answers, but she had seen enough, heard enough, to begin the final test, because, as she knew from long experience, the murderer was already afraid, and soon they would make a mistake. Chapter 7. Another Twist Friday dawned with a strange, almost theatrical clarity. The air had a chill that didn't quite belong to July, and the skies hung cloudless, as if holding their breath. It was, Miss Marple thought as she stirred her porridge, the sort of day when something inevitable was bound to happen. And indeed, it did. At exactly 10:42 a.m., Constable Fennel arrived breathlessly at the King's Wren and delivered news that sent Inspector Cray into immediate motion. There had been another incident, not another murder, thank heavens, but a crime nonetheless, and one that complicated everything that had come before. The bell at St. Jude's had been rung out of schedule 3 times by young Matthew Grinstead, who had run to the vicarage to report a break-in at the church vestry. The door had been forced. The small locked cupboard where the church records were kept had been wrenched open. The old tin cash box that held flower fund donations was missing, but more curiously and far more tellingly, a bundle of documents had been disturbed. The parish's deed registers, long untouched, had been rifled through, a few torn pages left scattered on the floor. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news, and she always heard the news, quietly set down her teacup and reached for her walking stick, because this was not random. This was not about coins or desperation. This was about destruction, the removal of evidence. Someone had returned to the scene not to cover the murder, but to erase its origin. Asterisk, asterisk, Inspector Cray, already sour from 5 days of ambiguous suspects and evasive interviews, was not pleased. Petty. Theft is one thing, he growled, standing in the church vestry, but this is tampering with church property. and legal records. Miss Marple stood to one side, peering quietly at the scattered pages with gloved fingers. "Someone was looking for something specific," she murmured. Cray turned toward her. "You mean they knew what they were after?" "Oh, yes. And more. Importantly, they knew where to find it." She lifted a page a corner, torn neatly, as if snatched in haste. "The index page for deeds filed between 1910 and 1920, the years surrounding Thomas Cartwright's death. Who would know about these archives?" Cray asked aloud. "The same person," Miss Marple replied gently, "who once had reason to forge." "Them," Cray frowned. "You're suggesting this was about that old orchard again?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that the orchard was never the root, only the stem. It's not the land, Inspector. It's what the land hides." Asterisk, asterisk. Meanwhile, another unexpected visitor arrived in the village. Raymond Bellamy Lionel's estranged younger brother appeared just after noon, suitcases in hand, arriving by the 11:30 bus from Melchester, clean-shaven, and with the brittle manners of a man who had long disapproved of his elder sibling. Raymond took rooms at the King's Wren and requested a meeting with Inspector Cray within the hour. Miss Marple observed him from her table in the tea-room and noted two things. First, he didn't ask about Lionel's death, only about Lionel's possessions. And second, he wore his grief not like a cloak, but like a borrowed overcoat. He meant to return quickly. Their conversation, overheard by the ever-watchful Mrs. Grinstead, soon became the talk of the green. Raymond had come, he said, because he'd received a letter posted by Lionel only days before the fete. In it, Lionel claimed to have uncovered a long-buried injustice, one which would restore the Bellamy name and disgrace a family built on fraud. He never mentioned Mrs. Cartwright by name, but it was clear who he meant. And then Raymond said something that made Miss Marple's teacup pause mid-air. "My brother feared for his life," he told Cray. "He wrote, 'If anything happens to me, look to the past. The truth lies not in what people claim they are, but in what they once were.'" Asterisk, asterisk. That evening, Miss Marple visited the church once more. Now quiet after the intrusion, the vicar met her in the vestibule, shaking his head sadly. "We've never had a break-in, not once in all my years here. But I suppose it was only a matter of time." "Reverend," she asked, "do you recall who managed the archives in 1913? He blinked. "That's a question. Let me see. Back then, it would have been the junior curate, Rev. Henry Braithwaite, I believe. He died in the war. And who would have signed off on a late amendment to a land deed? Likely the parish clerk or the vestry warden, if the clerk was unavailable. And who was the vestry warden at the time?" He paused. "I believe it was Mr. James Tremaine." "Being?" "He owned the paper shop before it became the post office." "Related to the current Mr. Tremaine?" "His grandfather, I think." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I see." Because she had seen something. Curious. She remembered Mr. Tremaine, the current one, walking near the jam tent the day of the fete. Most had dismissed him, just a councilman, always fussing over village bylaws. But Miss Marple remembered his fingers, ink-stained, twitchy, like a man always writing, always amending. And now she wondered if a grandfather forged something long ago, and a grandson feared discovery. What lengths might that grandson go to in order to protect a family name? Asterisk, asterisk. That night, rain swept over Chipping Darnley for the first time all week, soaking the village lanes and drumming against cottage windows like the slow ticking of a clock winding down Dot inside her parlor. Miss Marple sat with a blanket on her lap and the faintest smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. The case was unraveling now, not in grand declarations, but in quiet slips. The break-in, the brother's letter, the missing page. But what had not been accounted for, what none of the suspects had mentioned, was the spoon, the small tasting spoon used during judging. It had gone missing, a minor thing, easily overlooked. But in Miss Marple's world there were no minor things. Why had someone taken it? And more curiously, when she sipped her tea, eyes fixed on the rain outside. Tomorrow she would test a theory, gently, with care, as always, and she had a feeling the killer would finally show themselves, not through action, but through reaction. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test Saturday morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt almost rehearsed, as though the village itself sensed an ending approaching. Clouds hung thick but unthreatening, and the air smelled faintly of wet grass and honeysuckle. The fate was now a ghost of a memory, its footprints stamped in gossip and grief. Miss Marple had not slept well, not for lack of certainty, but for the weight of it. Knowing the truth, as she often said, was one thing. Proving it, watching it rise from beneath layers of denial and deception, was quite another, and so she had arranged a gathering, just a small one, under the respectable guise of a preserve-tasting brunch at the village hall. A tradition she said cheerfully she hoped to establish in honor of Mrs. Grinstead's tireless efforts in culinary adjudication. In truth, it was bait. She invited all the key figures, and each accepted. Mrs. Cartwright, George Pickersgill, Donkey Chudley, Mr. Tremaine, even Inspector Cray, who arrived stiffly, notebook in pocket, aware that Miss Marple rarely convened without cause. A long table was laid with linen and scones, fresh butter and 5 varieties of jam among them, a modest pot of lavender, which Miss Marple had made herself the night before, using a variation on her late Aunt Sybil's recipe, subtly less sweet, faintly sharper. A test of memory as much as palate. As guests settled and chatter began, Miss Marple watched quietly from her place at the head of the table, her napkin folded precisely on her lap. She observed who reached for the preserves and who didn't. She watched hands, expressions, flickers of doubt. She waited. Then, halfway through the second scone, she looked at Mr. Tremaine and asked very gently, "Would you mind terribly passing the lavender, Mr. Tremaine? You've hardly touched it." He froze for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "You don't care for it?" "I know, not particularly," he said, recovering with a forced smile. "Floral jams aren't to my taste." "Curious," she said lightly, as you praised the widow Cartwright's lavender entry quite loudly the day of the fete. Said it reminded you of your grandmother's kitchen." Tremaine's smile faltered. "Did I?" "Oh, yes," said Donkey Chudley from further down the table. "I remember that, too. You said it with such enthusiasm." Miss Marple dabbed at her mouth with her napkin. "And yet, this isn't hers, you know. It's mine. A different recipe entirely." Tremaine looked suddenly pale. "You see," she went on, in that gently disarming tone of hers, I was curious whether anyone would notice the distinction, especially someone who had already tasted the original so intimately as to move a jar that didn't belong under the judging table, and perhaps plant it at a scene. There was a moment of dense silence, broken only by the clink of a spoon against a teacup. Tremaine tried to speak. "Miss Marple, I hardly think—" "Oh, you did think," she interrupted, still smiling. "That's the difference, you see. This crime wasn't a moment of temper or passion. It was orchestration, and it failed in one crucial way, too theatrical. That gold ribbon, the misplacement, the missing tasting spoon. You wanted us to think that death came from the jam poison, perhaps, but you made it too obvious, which is why it was never about the jam at all." Across the table, Inspector Cray shifted forward in his seat. "You're accusing Mr. Tremaine?" he said slowly. Miss Marple turned to him. "Not formally, no. But I suspect strongly that Mr. Tremaine was the last person to speak with Lionel Bellamy before he died. And I suspect even more strongly that he knew about the forged land transfer in 1913, because his grandfather made it, and Lionel had found the proof." All eyes turned to Tremaine now, whose breath was short, mouth slightly open. "This is absurd," he said. "What possible motive would I have to harm Bellamy?" "To preserve your family name," Miss Marple replied gently. "Your grandfather benefited from the fraudulent acquisition of that land. You sat on the council for years, surrounded by records. You would know precisely what Bellamy was close to uncovering. But I wasn't near the laurels," he said quickly. "No one saw me, because you weren't meant to be seen. You knew the fate's schedule. You slipped around from the back during the judging distraction and confronted Bellamy. You struck him quickly, perhaps with the edge of a wooden post or a metal stake, and you left the jar near his body to mislead the eye. The silence that followed was long and heavy. Then Tremaine stood up too fast, too defensive. "Are you accusing me of murder on the basis of jam?" He spat. "No," said Miss Marple, folding her hands. "I'm accusing you based on your reaction and the fact that you knew which jam was which without even tasting it." Tremaine was taken in for questioning later that day. No formal charges were laid yet. But Inspector Cray, for the first time all week, looked at Miss Marple not with bemusement, but with wary respect. "You laid a trap," he said, walking with her outside the hall. "No, Inspector," she replied softly. "I offered an opportunity. It was he who revealed himself." Cray shook his head. "You saw what no one else did." "I simply paid attention," she said, "to people, not facts, to guilt that disguises itself as indignation, and to those little human tells. They're far more dependable than fingerprints." They parted ways at the gate, the mist beginning to rise again over Chipping Darnley's H-E-D-E-R-O-W-S. Miss Marple paused for a moment and looked back at the village hall. Now, quiet, the long table inside cleared of its teacups and scones. The game was nearly over, but one final piece remained. Chapter 9. The reveal. The drawing-room of the vicarage had seen births, engagements, gossip, and grief, but never, until this moment, a murder explained with such delicate precision. Miss Marple sat with her usual calm in a straight-backed chair beside the hearth. Present were Inspector Cray, Mr. Tremaine, pale, tight-jawed, the widow Cartwright, cool as ever, George Pickersgill, fidgeting, Dulcie Chudley, eager, perhaps too much so, and Alice Hemsley, who'd been invited for reasons she did not yet understand. Outside, the clouds had begun to break, casting slender gold shafts through the leaded windows. Inside, the atmosphere was still. Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap and began. "I have been told," she said, "that I often make too much of small things. A missing spoon, a ribbon, the placement of a jam jar. But I have found that in matters of murder, it is almost always the small things that tell the truth." She turned to Cray. "When Mr. Bellamy was found dead behind the laurel bushes, it appeared he had fallen, but the coroner's report showed his neck had been broken with force. The body's position was awkward-to posed, one might say, and near his arm was a shattered jar of lavender jam, not submitted in the competition, but clearly placed to Miss Ladd." "Miss Ladd how?" asked Cray, to suggest poison, to draw attention to the widow Cartwright. The widow raised a brow but said nothing. "But as I looked deeper," Miss Marple continued, "the story changed. George Pickersgill was publicly quarrelsome, but privately frightened. The widow Cartwright had motive to protect her late husband's secret, but no proof she had acted. Dulcie saw something and chose silence out of fear. And young Alice," she nodded to the girl, "heard the jar break before the body hit the ground." Alice blinked, startled. "I did. I told you that." "Yes, my dear. And that told me the jar wasn't dropped by Mr. Bellamy at all. It was planted shattered on the grass just before he died. A clever sleight of hand." Miss Marple now turned to Tremaine. "But it was you, Mr. Tremaine, who gave yourself away, not with evidence, but with knowledge. You recognized the jam without tasting it. You didn't even look surprised when I said it wasn't Cartwright's, because you already knew." Tremaine scoffed. "That's no proof." "It was enough to test you," Miss Marple said softly. "But I had more. Your grandfather was vestry warden in 1913. He helped quietly alter land records after the untimely death of Thomas Cartwright. A forged boundary deed. The orchard, in truth, never should have belonged to the Cartwrights. Lionel Bellamy found that out. He intended to expose the fraud." "He had no right," Tremaine said sharply. "He wanted to shame my family, destroy our name over something that happened before we were born." "You followed him behind the laurels, confronted him. He threatened exposure, and you panicked. Or perhaps you were coldly decisive. Either way, you struck him, then planted the jam unsubmitted, dressed in a gold ribbon you'd added yourself right. Near his hand." Tremaine was breathing heavily now. "I found the note he hid in the church records," Miss Marple added. "You tried to destroy it. You broke into the vestry and rifled the archives. But you didn't know he'd hidden a copy in the village history volume. I found it yesterday." Inspector Cray stood. "We'll need that note." "You'll have it," she replied, along with Dulcie's statement that Mr. Tremaine was seen near the table just before the scream, and the confirmation that the jar with the gold ribbon never passed judging. Tremaine's voice cracked. "He would have ruined everything. My position, my family's name over something I didn't even do." "No," Miss Marple said, her tone still gentle, "but you chose to do something else. You chose to kill to prevent the truth." Silence followed. Then Inspector Cray stepped forward. "Mr. Tremaine, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Lionel Bellamy." Tremaine didn't resist. He simply slumped back into the armchair, jaw slack, eyes staring at the carpet. The weight of generations collapsed around him. Asterisk, asterisk later, after the others had gone, Miss Marple remained by the window of the vicarage, sipping tea. The widow Cartwright stood beside her, gloves still in hand. "You've saved my reputation," the widow said softly, "though not, I suspect, entirely without reservations." Miss Marple gave her a sidelong glance. No one ever quite knows the full story of any death. Not even the innocent are entirely blameless in life. The widow nodded. "There was a lie. Years ago. I let it stand. I suppose that makes me complicit, or simply human," Miss Marple said. "We all choose our silences." She watched as the police car disappeared down the lane. "In the end," she murmured, "the jam was only a distraction." "Yes," the widow replied, "but it was your jam that unspooled it." Miss Marple smiled. "No," she said, "it was his fear." Chapter X. Aftermath life in Chipping Darnley resumed its gentle rhythm in the days following the arrest, as though the village itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled the weight of its secrets. The fate bunting was finally taken down. The laurel bushes, once cordoned off with police tape, had been clipped and reshaped by Peter Larch, the gardener, as if a tidy hedge might undo what had happened beneath it. And the church bell, which had tolled so strangely that Friday morning, rang properly again on Sunday 3 clean chimes to mark morning service, and not a whisper more, but no one in the pews forgot what had transpired. Mr. Tremane's absence was conspicuous. His shop was shuttered. The council meetings, once chaired with brisk efficiency, were now a disorganized affair run by Mrs. Pennington, who had a great fondness for order and a poor sense of time. George Pickersgill, after a brief and humbling public apology to the vicar and the village at large, returned to his routine, his temper notably subdued. It was said he now helped Alice Hemsley's father repair tools on weekends. Unpaid Donkey Chudley resumed her place at the sewing circle, albeit with a quieter tongue and a more careful eye. "I shan't involve myself in mysteries again," she said, though few believed her. The widow Cartwright never spoke publicly about the crime. Her lavender jam was notably absent from the shop shelves in the following month's church bake sale. Some said she was simply being discreet. Others whispered she had given up preserving altogether. When asked directly, she replied only, "There are some things best left uncooked." But most notable was the soft shift in how the village spoke of Miss Marple. For years she had been seen as a harmless old dear charming, polite, fond of gardening and needlepoint, the kind of person one invited out of courtesy, not necessity. But now there was a quiet reverence about her, an understanding unspoken but universal, that she saw more than she ever let on. Asterisk, asterisk, it was on the following Thursday that she received a letter, cream paper, a Melchester stamp, from Raymond Bellamy, who had returned to his home in Kent after settling his late brother's affairs. "Dear Miss Marple, you will not remember me well, but I remember you clearly. You saw the truth when no one else would, not just about Lionel, but about the burden of secrets. My family was never good at living without them. I thank you for ending that. Sincerely, R. Bellamy. Miss Marple placed a letter in her correspondence drawer, next to one from Scotland Yard regarding a case in St. Mary Mead, and another from her nephew Raymond, promising to visit but no doubt forgetting again. She stepped out into her garden, clippers in hand, and trimmed back the fading peonies. Bees hummed around the remaining blooms, and the breeze smelled faintly of rosemary. From down the lane she could hear Alice Hemsley laughing. Life was returning Dot. Miss Marple paused, tilted her head slightly, and considered the quiet. There would be another mystery in time. There always was. Wherever there were people, there were pretenses and passions and pride. But for now, Chipping Darnley slept peacefully again, and in her tidy kitchen, where a single unopened jar of homemade lavender jam sat on the shelf, Miss Marple boiled the kettle and prepared her tea, 1 sugar. No jam. Dot. She preferred things simple and true. The end.